Hello and welcome to Fresh Perspectives. My name is Gail, and I'm welcoming back today a guest I had on in the spring, who some of you probably are familiar with his newspaper articles, Marshall Greentein. Thank you for coming on again.
Well, thanks for having me again.
Now, getting back to your newspaper articles, before we get on to the topic I invited you here to talk about, I still haven't found out what happened to Hal, the truck driver. Could you fill us in on that a little bit? You know, the newspaper never put it in. Now they've gone on to some guy named Jasper.
Oh, well, I'd have to actually almost want to keep you in suspense, but I wish they would have. I didn't know they did not publish this. Yeah, Hal was a truck driver, and what we find out at the end is I wish you'd have read it, but they all connected. Hal was the father of
the girl with a two-part.
Right. And what had happened was, really the gist of it is that, as I put it, Hal was found to have, though he was a able-bodied truck driver, a good man in many respects, and was the main income source in the family. Also, we find, being the fact that he was on the road a lot and lonely and such, some of the way that he was able to satisfy some of his loneliness was to stop at various places that had gambling, and he began to get involved in that, and began to spend far more money than necessary, and he ended up with a gambling problem, which caused then irreparable harm to his family and marriage, because they lost their home. It went into foreclosure, all these kind of consequences that might happen to somebody with a gambling problem that he was in denial with. So the girl was his daughter, and it was a mother and daughter. They lost the house, they lost the home, they divorced, and they went on to move to get away and start a fresh life. And Hal, the question was, for Hal, was would he be able to consider that he does have a gambling problem, how it may have caused himself and others in his family problems, and perhaps he needed to really strongly consider getting some help for his gambling problem.
Are they related to Jasper?
No, that's a whole different.
That's a whole different story.
Yeah, different people. Yeah.
Yeah, we used to have a cat named Jasper. Okay, we're coming up on, we're just a few days away from Thanksgiving, and Christmas will be just around the corner after that. I suppose you probably have plans.
Yes, we do have family plans.
Oh, that's good.
Yes. Okay,
tell us again what your job description is.
Well, I have a private practice in Jamestown on West 3rd Street. I've been doing that for nearly 30 years. I'm a licensed mental health counselor in New York State. I'm also a licensed marriage and family therapist in New York State. And over the years, I've developed a lot of different new and different approaches and tried things, and I see people for an assortment of problems, men and women, some children, adolescents, for problems that they may present that may turn out to be something different. That's why I put in some of those articles. It's a surprise. Sometimes how people present themselves may not necessarily turn out to be what the deeper rooted problem is. And I've been able to develop and work and continue to grow and try to help people look at themselves to help them to grow and get out of being stuck, whether it's in a marital problem or a family problem, behavioral problem, some kind of mental health issue, and that's what I've been doing for almost 30 years now.
Okay, sometimes from your articles I get the impression that it's a little bit hard for you to get people to come right out and tell you what the real problem is.
Yes. Well, I think a lot of times the people come in with an understanding from their own perspective of what the problem is. What often they may not realize is that they're carrying, maybe that problem is kind of like there's a greater root that they haven't looked at, and that's what I'm getting to look at, you know, something deeper, something they may have carried, whether it be a marital problem or some depression, like I said, anxiety that's affecting them. They're functioning from day to day, their work, their relationships to the world and such, and maybe their spiritual outlook and such. So I get them to look at maybe something deeper, and for those who do that, I find that some people have prospered in terms of growing and feeling better about their lives and themselves and the people around them.
Okay. Now, the United States has been involved in a war in the Middle East for 15 years, especially Afghanistan. And I know, like with that, and with people from the Vietnam War, many years ago, like before our generation, there were people, they used to call it shell shock.
Yes.
Years ago, but now it's called PTSD or so have you had to counsel people who had PTSD?
Yes, yes. And both for war and for, and as you know, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And the shell shock was something that was shown even as far back. There's probably notations and studies, people pointing that out from even the Civil War, Revolutionary War in our own country. Never mind.
Even ancient wars, probably.
Ancient wars, you know, we're able to see that, but they called it different things, and they did different things for it. You know, in the Vietnam War, you know, for some people, there was. I had a colleague who was a psychiatrist who was a Vietnam War veteran, and that's what he did. He was a psychiatrist there, like you would see on MASH, but this is for real. And learned a lot from him, how people were sent back into the fray, you know, when they came back with what seemed to be that shell shock thing, and he had to get people back because that was his orders. And things have now changed a lot, where we're seeing that the suffering from war veterans, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, you know, has grown more and more and more. So we see more people, particularly, I guess, in our country from the Vietnam War era, who were diagnosed with that and getting treatment more and more and more in VA hospitals, maybe through private practitioners, medical people who do the work that I do in the community, or clinics. And now and I think it's growing and growing more and more and more as we have wars such as the Gulf War in Iraq, Afghanistan. More and more and more people are coming, soldiers, men and women, are coming back, and as a consequence, for some, and that's, the studies are kind of not all in uniform about how, and consistent as far as percentages. The low percentage is about 30%. There are many through the VA that believe that about 30% of the returning soldiers who have seen action, seen war, seen death, been a part of that and destruction, come back and to their communities. Maybe 30% present in immediately, some over time. It could be a year or two later, oddly enough.
Oh, really? It doesn't always show up as soon as they've had the bad experience?
Yes, no. Sometimes those things don't show up, because I think what has happened, one of the things we've learned, or are learning as practitioners, is that for many people, and this is not just for war veterans too, we see it with people who've been had the consequence of a sexual violation, or people who were in accidents, car accident, plane crashes, people who survived, and a host of things. All these shootings that we're hearing across the country. One of the things we're not necessarily hearing right away as a consequence is the innumerable people who might be, might is the operative word here, is might be as a consequence a candidate, so to speak, poor way of choice of words on my part, for post-traumatic stress, or at least some anxiety, some depression. But those things may not show up for a while, and they show up through different dysfunction, daily functioning, whether it's appetite, sleep, we usually look at, and a host of things. So there's a growing body of people, and I'm including myself, who believe that it's more than maybe 30%, because some people don't show it again right away. And there are many people, and we saw that in many studies during the Vietnam War, where many soldiers came back and went away. They just left. So they were almost like they were discounted, as if they weren't in existence, but they are in existence. Many went to the northwest, as I understand, into the mountains of Montana, Idaho, Oregon, Washington, those places, to get away. Some were heard of to build cabins and just to live off the land, because they just couldn't deal with it. So the VA system could not say, well, these people do have PTSD or they don't, but for some, and I have treated some who've come to me who, for some reason, decided to get out of the woods and see if they could live in the general society.
Oh. Yeah, I had a cousin who apparently had PTSD after being in Vietnam. He had nightmares that he just couldn't get them to stop, and he was one of these people that that took off and went away, you know, and the family didn't know where he was for a long time. And eventually they got a phone call from a district attorney down in the state of Georgia. He'd been murdered by a person who was schizophrenic that lived in the same building that he did. The person had even admitted to doing it, you know. But, you know, it was a very sad set of circumstances. I mean, to begin with, he was very unhappy and had PTSD that apparently wasn't being treated, and then on top of everything else, his life ends at the age of 35 by being murdered.
Yeah.
So
pretty horrible, huh?
Yeah, it was pretty shocking to get the news.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you know, one of the although I think it's changed with this current war in Afghanistan, and some people don't call it a war, but I think war, a rose is a rose, you know, call it what it is. I think one of the things we're seeing, one of the things that I may have talked about the last time we spoke in May, in the Vietnam War, what made that extraordinary was that was the first war where people were actually able to sit down at night after dinner, watch the TV news, and see what looked like the first reality TV, except people were really dying.
It was really horrific.
That's right. It wasn't someone in an hour movie who was, you know, killed and then, you know, cut, and then they get up and they walk out and enjoy their life.
Right.
Real people were dying.
Yeah.
You know, and they were people who were our soldiers, the soldiers who may have been considered the enemy there. And as a consequence to that, it wasn't only the soldiers who came back here, or the soldiers of Vietnam, North Vietnamese, Viet Cong, or South Vietnamese soldiers in Vietnam. It was also all those people we don't think about. All the people we talk about that in our country with 9/11 and the 3,000 or so people who lost their lives. How horrible! And the people who, the first responders, all of those folks who subsequently have, some of whom have had horrible you know, lives to live from that, physically and mentally. But we forget sometimes about the people who are just regular folks who are just living their lives, whether it be in the cities or in the country, whose lives were torn apart from bombings and such. They even say today that in Laos, I was reading in my National Geographic magazine recently, in Laos still has, pays the consequences of the Vietnam War from all those many years, because there were so many mines and that were set and weren't exploded, and people are still walking around innocently, living their lives,
and getting blown up by
and then getting blown up.
Oh, how awful!
You know, and so talk about like an you know, ongoing potential
it's like
PTSD
an
crisis.
thing.
You know.
Yeah, there's a set of programs. We saw the first one. Some friends showed it to us at their house. Apparently, this business with Vietnam actually had its start in the later part of the 1800s, which it was something the French were doing or something, but I can't remember all the details. But well, it was an ongoing thing for years and years before we actually were told we were having a war with Vietnam. You know, I can't remember the name of that series. I'll have to. I'll have to check remember, with the friends.
At one time, that whole area was called French Indochina. So things have changed over the years, but some things are not.
there was something going on there. It almost seems like the French wanted to take it over, but they wanted to use the Vietnamese people for servants or something like that. You know, it's stuff that we never learned in the history books when we were kids going to school, I'll tell you. Have you spoken with any people who have become permanently physically disabled as a result of being in any of these wars?
Well, you know, it's interesting how this sometimes works. I did have some people that I saw from the Vietnam War, and they've had some physical disabilities. But there's one person that I think about who I saw from as a veteran from the Afghan War and Iraq War, and he was a Special Forces man. He came in to see me because he and his wife were having marital problems, which he began to understand, and so did she, from a lot of research people that they knew, was very common, and it's very common we see that throughout all wars, that the men and women who often fight in the wars come back and are challenged to deal with their marriages for lots of reasons. It would take up much more than this whole show today. But this man that I saw was working. He was pretty amazing. He was working, and you look at him, he looked like a picture of health. But he also was suffering and getting help through the VA for brain dysfunctions.
That was caused by an accident? An injury?
Right, he was, his vehicle was blown up by a landmine, and he survived. I think one of his colleagues died as a consequence of that, and yet he was able to somehow come back. He gets treatments for traumatic brain injury and other consequences like that. But again, to look at him, he represents the picture of great health. He's articulate.
You can't tell just by seeing him.
And that was something that for me as a professional, to be educated beyond what I may read in books or watch and read in journals. This was a beautiful example for me, a wonderful example for me to grow and to learn by realizing that you can't always tell what's going on by what you see until a person opens up. And he was able to talk about this beyond the problems in his marriage.
Well, while I was making up my questions for you for this program, I got to thinking kind of deeply about the idea of maybe losing an arm or a leg or something like that. And it occurred to me that these people might actually experience, go through the grief experience that you get when you lose one of your family members. Do you think that that's possible, that they feel that way? I mean, it's going to change your life forever, when you lose a limb or something.
And again, when we talk about post-traumatic stress, it's not in like a loss of a limb. In many ways there are similar, there are different, unique values and components to someone who might lose a limb due to landmine, a war veteran, or somebody who was shot and not able to get medical aid in time to save a limb, or someone who may have been, we read about the people who were in the Boston Marathon bombing and people who lost limbs there and having to deal with that. And what we don't know often here, beyond what we see physically, is people learning to deal with getting prostheses and such, and maybe getting on to some degree in their life, is the emotional, the mental, maybe even the spiritual dysfunction or compromised function that may occur. So there's a lot of that goes on, and I think people are more apt to want to talk about what they see, difficult as it is, the physical disability, the loss of a limb. What do I do with that, and how does my family deal with that, versus those who might have some mental, emotional disorder as a consequence of that. We don't always see that. They may not necessarily speak of that, and I'm not sure even the media gives adequate attention to that as a loss.
Yeah, I just figure, you know, that's probably what I would go through if I lost.
Sure, and a grief reaction is well said, because it is, we're dealing with a real loss. And for the people who lose a limb, you know, they're still alive. We can say, oh, you're alive, why are you grieving? But you do grieve, and it's normal, it's natural, and it's again a consequence of losing that, because it is a loss. You are not the same.
Yeah. Okay. Now the suicide rate, from what I've been hearing, sounds like it's pretty high among people in the armed services. What do you know about that? Well,
I know that they came out like back to the Vietnam War. It said there was a startling figure that I kept shaking my head in amazement of some 50,000 people who were American soldiers who were killed in the Vietnam War. That may have changed. That was probably an underestimation. But there were those who believed that maybe a same number, maybe less, but it's still huge, have committed suicide soon after coming back, and even since, even years today. You can walk around today and see people who, with a lot of pride, are walking around with hats that say Vietnam veteran. I've met some people who talked and just didn't, you know, not to talk because I'm do this kind of professional work, but just saying hi, how you doing, just being friendly day to day. And sometimes I've heard people, I met a gentleman years ago and said hi, and we were just talking, and he started talking about himself. It was great. And he was talking about being a Vietnam veteran, what that was like, and how his life has changed, that he has PTSD, he's on full disability, how he's often had to go to see a psychiatrist, how he's thought about suicide on many occasions, how it has messed up his marriage, how it's affected his work. He's no longer able to work. But again, this is a guy that walks around. He's just an older character, about my age, maybe a little older. He looks the part of just an old guy walking around with a hat and having a smile on his face and being a nice person. But he's suffering. And we don't see that because he's got a lot of pride, doesn't show it.
Right, right.
And talked about suicide, how rampant that is. And I think it's still happening, and I think more and more it is happening even with our current wars. People are coming back, and I don't know what the numbers are. I just know that I've dealt with some veterans who talk about that, and that's scary. It's really scary for them. Sometimes it's scary for me to hear that and what they're capable of doing, especially those who've been trained so well to not think about emotions.
Oh, yeah.
And to do their job, and then they do it well.
Yeah.
But they may come back, and then that's one of the problems that we see with PTSD, is when people come back from war to their communities, and even though they may have parades and they get medals and maybe gifts, and you might, here's a car and here's this and all that, they still have to live their lives.
Well, you know, I would think that it would be hard, not just because being involved in the action in war would be terribly scary to begin with, but if they've had to kill somebody, I would think that that would affect them emotionally too, if they knew that they had to do that.
Yes. Well, I remember I may have said it last time that I had one particular Vietnam War veteran who came to see me very reluctantly, only because of his wife's incredible push and love and encouragement to see somebody, and he didn't want to go to the VA. He just hated the VA bureaucracy so badly. This was many years ago, so he wanted to see somebody privately because he wanted to have it quiet. So they somehow connected with me, and you know, and I saw him for many, many years. He died as a result of you know, his interaction with Agent Orange. Years later. And such. But I learned a lot again from him, and from him one of the things that he talked about very reluctantly. I mean, this wasn't a flow. This was just like chopping little bits and pieces over time. Was the fact that he was told and he had to shoot a child. I asked him one day, and how that came about was he was just simply telling me that his one child that he and his wife had, they had a daughter. He said that one of the things that that set him off, meaning he couldn't handle her crying. The natural order of life, children cry. For what reason? Whatever reason. They need attention or whatever is the case.
Sometimes for something really unimportant they cry about.
But, and his story, and to make a huge complicated matter of his experience in Vietnam, to bring it down to earth, was he said that he couldn't handle it because he was in a situation, a firefight, where he was running with the other soldiers towards a helicopter to get out of a very difficult situation, and he turned around and a child had in his hand what looked to be a hand grenade. So he turned around, somebody yelled to him, he said, and turned around and fired and killed. The last thing he saw was the boy dead.
And what was actually in the child's hand?
It was a hand grenade.
It was a hand grenade.
Yeah, that's what he said. But the last thing he did was he shot the boy, turned around, didn't wait to see what was going on. He had to he and his fellow soldiers on the helicopters to get out of a firefight. And as a consequence to that, we fast forward years later. He comes home, and he and his wife have a child, and you know, it's what seems to be a normal life, and the baby starts crying, and he just said, I remember he used to put his hands on his head and he couldn't take it. He couldn't take it. And his wife was understanding because he was able to share with her this, but he'd have to retreat, and that made him feel inadequate as a man, as a father, that he couldn't even handle the simple, normal, natural, daily occurrences of what happens with children. Like sometimes they cry. He couldn't handle that.
Do you think that do some of these people with these problems, do they get well ever? You know,
that's the question for the ages, because I think anybody would have to come back quickly with what does well mean. I think what we
back to their what was normal for them before having these experiences.
You know what? I can't answer that question.
You don't know the answer.
Because I think for some people who get help, I have to be biased here. I think the people who get help, and not just going to someone like myself or to a VA or a system or non-VA system to get help, I think it also takes the community, it takes wives or husbands, families, significant others to be understanding, and sometimes it just does not pan out. Sometimes it doesn't, and it's difficult for some. And for others, I want to believe that it works well enough that they do okay. They do okay. And again, it's not everybody who comes back from wars, even if they've seen or been a participant in death and destruction, that has PTSD as a consequence to that. There's all sorts of scientific theories about who may or may not be susceptible to that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, how does it affect the parents of military people? What do they go through when their children are killed while serving? Have you met any parents who've
Yeah,
had to deal with this?
you know, not as much. Mostly, I think I dealt with the wives, or you know, especially in the Vietnam War, mostly men that I dealt with and their wives or significant others. I think common sense would dictate that it's different for everybody. I think we've seen situations or read about where some people believe my kids didn't die in vain. They died for their country, and they're very patriotic, and they believe this and they follow this, and they would seem to be okay. But we're not sure if that today okay might later on, as they deal with their grief and not having their child who's 19, 20, 21 years old, you know, is buried, and they get the flag and everything, but it's a great symbol, except you're still not dealing with watching your kid grow, maybe get married, have grandchildren and all that. So I think later on there may be a time, even if it may be silently for one or both parents, that they might look around and say, gee, look what I'm missing. You know, so-and-so, Mary and Joe here across the road, they have grandkids, and they're bringing them over and showing them off, and we don't have grandkids to show off because our kid was killed and he didn't have a chance to live his life.
Yeah.
So for some people, they don't do well, and some of those people actually go out and become activists and try to do something for other people, which is wonderful, and others just live their life and deal silently maybe with the grief and the loss.
I've always thought that probably losing a child or a grandchild would be the worst, probably the worst thing a person would have to go through, you know, really. So I guess some people never really get over it.
No, I think that's true for any war, and I think one of the things we have to, sometimes I think I know I forget, and I have to remind myself, is we focus so much attention in such a in a narrow perspective about our own country. But there are wars that have been going on, still going on in Africa today, not just that may not get as much media attention, where children, families are starving, women, and this is, you know, throughout the ages, women, as a consequence of war, have been sexually violated and continue to be, and we can only begin to imagine what the consequence of that is over time, especially seen, though, in wars that have been overseas. So we haven't had that in our country, whether it be in the Vietnam War and the Gulf War, Afghanistan, places all over the globe that continues to go on, and there's more. We don't see that. We just see our own, but it still exists.
Okay. Now, how do these wars affect marriages?
Well, I think, again, every situation is different. I think I've worked with some veterans who've come back, and dealing with their marriages has been difficult. And one of the problems around that, and I'm hoping it's changing. I don't have a insight into it, but I think the VA system, from people I know who've used the system, say that they don't really do very much work with marital problems. They'll just deal with the PTSD for the individual soldier or serviceman or servicewoman.
So that's tough if if it affects your marriage.
Well, and that's well said. I think that we can almost laugh in the face of the agony that people you know, we see in movies, I think some of the extreme, or read in books, the extremes of what goes on in reality. And I think there are many who will say that soldiers forever have come back and have somehow gotten on with their marriages. My father was in Europe, came back to a marriage that was young, because he went, you know, soon after, like a lot of men got married quickly for sentimental purposes and lots of reasons. And, you know, my mom was pregnant. She had my older brother, birthed him while my dad was still in Europe in World War II. So he comes back and he had to deal with, hey, hi, honey, and I'm back home, and who's this? You know, and having to deal with that, and a connection, and a reintegration into a family that's been running in his absence, even though missing him. They're still running, so he has to get used to that, and that's something that has been a continual saga, a continual problem for a long time. People are gone, soldiers are gone for their year or 10 months or 2 years of active duty, and with little contact with their family, but life continues with children, without children, whatnot, and then they come back and they have to reintegrate back into, this is what's going on, and here's who I am, and by the way, I didn't deal very well with, possibly with my emotions, because emotions and training for the military, we understand that. If you're emotional, you may be killed yourself or set up your colleagues to get killed. So they just learn to just deal with things without emotion. But they come back, and that's a big thing that we try to help people with, is reintegrating not only into the family, reintegrating into themselves to learn how to effectively identify and deal with their own emotions that are real, because they set them aside as if they put them up on a shelf, so to speak, and then they put them back and re-injected it into their psyche. And it's like, oh, that's the real world? That wasn't the real world when you're out and following orders to...
Yeah. And the children of people who are in the armed forces, how do the children feel about a parent being so far away for so long? And how does it affect them if the parent gets killed?
I think common sense would kind of answer that question. I think every child, just like every person left at home, has his or her own kind of experience. And, you know, there's some soldiers that come back with PTSD, or they may have some physical limitations or handicap from the war, or if they come back because to be buried because they've been they're dead. You know, it's tough, and you know, we would say, I think, immediately that the child is at risk. At risk for what? At risk for growing up with the possibility of dealing with the after effects of where's daddy. Now, again, it depends. You know, a lot of children may be a year old and still, you know, hanging out with mom and nursing or not, and then some may be a little older, or maybe there's several kids, you know, or, you know, we see the pictures of the soldiers coming home for, a short visit and getting a lot of daddy, which is wonderful, but then what happens when daddy goes back to, you know, to fight a war for his country? You know, you still have a lot of kids who miss the normal, natural, day-to-day occurrences of life with mom and dad, the good, the bad, and everything in between. So I think I think that's a great question, and I think that gets probably less attention.
Yeah, I usually don't hear this particular aspect of it being brought up in the news or anything, you know. Yeah,
and I think it's a great question, because I think what we might see, and I think "might" is the operative word here, is that in the future, you know, these kids might grow up without a lot of answers. You know, how does a case where, you know, a woman gets a call being told that her husband has been killed in action. She's dealing with her grief and the loss. Then she has to also yet be the mother, the best mother she wants to be, and hopefully has been to her child or children, and has to do all of that. And how does she do all that? I don't have an answer to that.
Well, it makes a person stronger, I guess, probably.
Well, I think in some cases it might.
If they do what they have to do.
That's right. That's right. And hopefully, the VA, I'm not sure, but hopefully, you know, some of these people who are left behind get some help if they need that. And I know there are groups for women, for wives, for help, and I think a lot of that are support groups and such, but I think some might need some extra help through their medical doctor, or through the VA system, through, you know, maybe their own post-traumatic stress of sorts, or anxiety around that loss.
Okay, we're going to take a short break for a few minutes here. Back when Mary Bell B was on my program back in the spring, we showed about a half an hour's worth of video footage of her, and also a little talk by a lady in Costa Rica about a lady named Peace Pilgrim, who had hoped that she was contributing towards putting an end to war by walking back and forth across the country for the rest of her life. So Chris is going to run that for us now.
Pray for God's gentle peace within. May the pilgrimage now begin. Peace of mind within our hearts. All who love God walk in peace. Let us walk in the way of our God. Let us walk in.
My name is Mary Newswanger. We're here on the beautiful grounds of the United Nations University for Peace, located in Costa Rica, outside the rural town of Ciudad Colón. Costa Rica is a peaceful country which successfully abolished its army in 1948, more than 50 years ago. We are proud of this heritage which has inspired so many around the world, and which serves as an example that peace is possible in a world beset by conflict of every kind. Here, in the year 2000, a statue of an extraordinary woman, known only as Peace Pilgrim, was set in the Peace Garden to acknowledge and give international recognition to her single-minded commitment for peace and the continuous and growing impact that her life's work for peace had on countless individuals across the globe. The idea for this statue was inspired by Dr. Robert Mueller, former Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations and Chancellor Emeritus of the United Nations University for Peace. His dream was realized with the help of many, including well-known Costa Rican sculptor Fernando Calvo, living history actress Jamila Erickson, and John and Ann Rush, the founders of Friends of Peace Pilgrim. Peace Pilgrim left behind a living legacy to the entire world. Her life was dedicated, given entirely as a prayer for peace. Her timeless example and her profoundly simple yet moving message for peace is an inspiring, eloquent gift to all of humanity. Who was she? One of the great human beings to walk the face of the earth in this or any age.
She took a vow to walk penniless until mankind had learned peace.
This is a real pilgrimage. It's actually a journey on foot. I don't hitchhike. I walk in spite of all the rides that are offered, and on faith. I took a vow at the beginning that I would remain a wanderer until mankind has learned the way of peace, walking until I am given shelter, and fasting until I am given food. And although I have never asked for anything, I can truthfully say that I have been supplied.
Oh. She was just one of the most incredible people I ever heard of, but you've never heard of her.
No, that's great though. I'd like to learn more about
maybe
her.
You'll have to go on the internet or something and see what you can find out about her, but she was quite an extraordinary person. I would like to see more peace in the world myself.
Yeah, me too.
And I know I've seen a couple of movies. One is an old one called The Deer Hunter. It was about the Vietnam War era. And I guess one of the guys, it was like a bunch of friends who'd signed up to go in the Army or something around about the same time, but they would go deer hunting. You know, before they were in the Army, they'd go deer hunting. And this one guy, he seemed to have a reputation for being pretty good at it, but the one thing that struck me in the movie was he usually didn't, when he'd see a deer and had a good opportunity to shoot it, he'd let it go. And but it showed a lot of the nightmarish kind of stuff, you know, that went on in Vietnam, like these Viet Cong or whatever they were called. They were forcing these men to play Russian roulette with a gun, where they'd have to pass it around and pull the trigger until one of them got shot and stuff like that. And and then there was the one guy that stayed back in Vietnam when the others went home, and he got involved in some sort of a gambling ring where they were you could place bets on who was going to be the one that got shot, and they must have kept him drugged or something, you know. And when finally, when one of the friends figured out what was going on and went to Vietnam to try to talk him into coming home, he winds up shooting himself and killing himself in the head. It was almost like he was in some sort of a trance or something and had no control over himself, and he shot himself in the head and died. And well, he was somehow getting money off of these bets, and he'd been sending it to a VA hospital or something where a severely injured, physically injured friend of his was for treatment to help him out, is what it seemed like. That's how the other friend that went back to try to get him to come home it was the one in the hospital contacted him. I keep getting this money, you know, he keeps sending this money. Where could he possibly be getting this money to send to me, to help me? And so the friend wound up finding out, yeah, it was gambling money, but he wound up dying. So, so it had a pretty tragic ending, that movie, but... you said you'd seen it years ago, but you don't remember it very well? I don't have much memory.
I do, it just, if I might say, it did trigger a memory of another war veteran that I saw a number of years ago, and the one thing I remembered about him was he would talk about hunting. He said he was an avid sportsman, had been a deer hunter throughout his whole life, and then went to war, and talked about, you know, just in time, was able to talk delicately about killing people. And he came back and home, and he said he seemed to be in pretty good shape and spirit. And he talked about, I remember going out in the woods, and he had his shotgun, and he saw a deer. And he said he looked at it, he had it as all he had to do was pull the trigger. And he said something struck him. He stopped. He put the safety on, walked out of the woods without shooting, and said he put his gun away and never went back out in the woods. He said he could not kill another thing again, even if it was a deer.
Well, you know, it's pretty synchronistic this time that we happen to be talking about that movie, The Deer Hunter, right now, and you talk about the man's experience with not being able to shoot the deer. Because of this interview that we're doing right now just happens to be on the first day of deer hunting season.
Yes.
So, it's, and I wasn't even thinking about that the day at the time we scheduled it, you know, but here we are. But there was another one that you said you didn't see that just came out last winter. It was called Hacksaw Ridge, about the guy who joined the Army as a medic and refused to have anything to do with using a gun or shooting anybody, but he managed to save numerous lives in one battle. somehow, seemingly miraculously, just by his faith. It had something to do with him being Seventh-day Adventist, the reason he didn't want to have anything to do with the guns. So it was pretty interesting that he managed to do what he did without ever having used a gun or killing anybody, you know. So, and he was won awards for what he managed to accomplish. So
pretty amazing story.
I can't remember what the guy's name was, but it was actually a true. The movie was made about a true story.
Yeah.
It was about.
I think I read a little bit about it. But it really, you know, all these things, all these stories really, I mean, everybody has his own, her own story, and everybody who goes to war, whoever you are, whoever they are, those people are, they have their story, and some people come back, hopefully if they come back alive from wars, still have their story. The story may or may not be one that they won't even talk about. There are others who freely speak about it. I used to I remember having to get some firewood one time, and found somebody who lived in my area who sold firewood. And he was a Vietnam veteran. I didn't know that. And he was talking about it one day, and just I told him a little bit about doing counseling for Vietnam, therapy for Vietnam vets. And he looked at me, and I'll never forget it. He said, you know, not verbatim, he said he saw the same thing as others did, death and destruction. He came back, and he said for reasons that for him personally were more spiritually oriented. He said his faith, his strong faith and his belief in God, he believes contributed to his being able to kind of keep his life in order and not lose sight of the importance of what and the value of what he learned, what he did for his country, that belief, and to move on with his life. He had a wife, he had children, he had a successful business, he was doing well in many respects, and he said he felt badly for those colleagues, those soldiers who weren't in that same position. And so it was kind of special for me to hear that, because an admission of, boy, I'm fortunate, and there were things that, for his story, contributed to his good health and well-being, as he would portray that. For others, he said he felt he had a lot of sympathy, a lot of heartfelt feelings for, and he said, he said, thank you for what you do or others do to help, because he said these people need help. He was just glad it wasn't him.
Yeah, well, he managed to keep his head together, and that's good. So he was living happily then.
That's right, right. And reminded me that there are probably far more numbers who come back from all kinds of wars, no matter how bad was the experience, as we would think, we like to believe that all that death and destruction isn't the natural order of life. We've just created it to be a part of the natural order. And many people come back, and they seem to get on with their life and be okay. For some others, of course, whatever percentage it is, I don't care if it's 30% or 20%, or maybe it's 50%. Those people need help, and we need to be able to help them.
Yeah. You know, I'm thinking that we don't have the draft at this point in history as far as the Army and like that is concerned. So it's on a voluntary basis.
Yes.
But I think of people in the age group where they start going in is people who've just come out of high school or college or something.
Yes.
And they should have their whole lives ahead of them, is the way I see it. And I kind of want to encourage young people that if they're thinking about enlisting in the service, to think about this very, very carefully. You know, if they want to live that long life and have a family and everything, to think seriously about whether or not they really want to enlist.
Yeah.
You know?
Thank you.
So that's my point of view about it.
Well, you know, the one thing that I would like to add here to that reminded me, I'm smiling about, because the person the way the person said it to me, was a woman, actually, the wife of a veteran, and she was a veteran too. And she said to me one day, you know, war is for single people, not married people. She just put it succinctly like that. Didn't have to explain herself, didn't ask for any feedback from me, but I always remember her saying that. You know, if you're gonna go to war, go and enlist, that just being single is a whole lot better.
Well, I just figure, you know, if somebody has dreams they want in life that they want to pursue, they might not think too seriously about enlisting in the service. Some people who didn't have to be in war zones and so forth actually say they enjoyed being in the service.
Yeah, for some they might have had you know, maybe they had a good camaraderie and a lot of enjoyment.
And they didn't have to go to Afghanistan or Vietnam, and you know, so.
And some might have fared well dealing with the structure that the military brings and such, and may have grown up in ways mentally, emotionally, that were helpful for them. And you know, so there may be some good things coming from that. But once going into war and fighting and shooting and whatnot, beyond all of the patriotic duty and obligations that people may see, there still is a consequence to that.
Well, we're down to 1 minute and 20 seconds. So is there anything you want to get in here real quick before we come to the end of the program?
Well, in light of the subject at hand today, it's only one part of certainly the whole of the work that I do and the practice. I don't exclusively see war veterans.
No, of course not.
Of course not. But I think, you know, again, I think the stigma, I want to believe, of mental health problems, whether they're marital, whether they're individual, whatever is the case, children, behavioral, moods, whatnot, I think the stigma, I want to believe, is starting to kind of wane, and I want to believe that there are people out there who might have problems, but for whatever reason are drawing back or you know, on their heels. You know, please, you know, find someone to talk with. It's great, and particularly my brethren with men. You know, I've often said, and I've written about it too, that you know, women forever have been the people who have, in that gender, have sought help, sought effective ways to grow in mind, body, and spirit more than men. And I think more men are beginning to get that and reach out. So to my brothers out there, men of the world, you know, if you got something going on like a Hal, or Jasper, as maybe you'll learn, you know, get some help and ask for some help. It's a wonderful thing.
Well, thank you again for coming on today. It was really nice of you, and I'll see the rest of you in a couple of weeks.
All right.